Commander Central episode 234, and today we're going to be talking about how we go about brewing up a deck. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Morris.
Morris, patron, supporter, and friend of the show. How's it going?
Pretty good.
We've been threatening to have you on for a while. This was one of the Patreon tiers, and you were one of the first people that signed up for it. But then COVID happened, and Chris wasn't around for a bit, so we're finally able to have you on. So thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks a lot for supporting the show. We appreciate it.
Not a problem. It's my pleasure.
Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about your history with playing Magic and when you started playing Commander in particular.
All right. So I learned Magic back just out of high school and had a lot of free time. So my friend that was playing one day said, "Hey, do you want to learn?" And gave me the infamous warning that I'll show you this, but it's addictive. So I was hooked. Since then, I always kept an eye for different formats. A long time ago, before EDH was a thing, I played a thing called the Stack, which was just a massive pile of singleton, like 1,000, 2,000 cards, whatever you had, whatever you felt like. Sure. And so then later on, I played Standard, Legacy, Modern, Pauper, Tiny Leaders, the greatest hits. And then, EDH came around. I jumped in with both feet and, haven't looked back. It was just a fun format, play with different people, became more and more popular. It was just easier to get out and, play with whoever because it was just everywhere. Yeah, because I don't have a very centralized play group. So I end up driving, to the local, to the next town over or whatever, which is half an hour drive for me at the smallest, time.
Sure.
So, yeah, and but I've gone out to, hour and a half drives to, by you guys. So
yeah, you're not precisely local, but you do come to our store and play quite regularly enough, at least when there's not a active pandemic in progress.
Yeah, that's how I actually met you guys and found out about the show, was playing in tournaments there, and you guys were hosting or commentating. So
yeah, that's right. That's been several years since we did that, but yeah, our local shop used to have a pretty frequent 1v1 tournament, EDH style tournament, using the MTGO rules, and at least a couple of times Max did like a streaming commentary on those matches, and I did it at least once, I think, with him. So that's been a few years, but I remember you played. Were you playing? It was a Selvala deck, I believe.
I got beat by a Selvala deck.
Okay.
But I played Animar a bit.
Okay.
And we played the 2v2. It was like two at a giant. We did that a lot. I won one of those. Yeah, it was lots of fun. In fact, back then, we played Marilyn
of the Morning Song, right?
Marilyn of the Morning Song, yes.
Sure.
Who's coming back into, style now because of Opposition Agent. But we kind of did that style in Two at a Giant, where one was Marilyn and the other one had the red enchantment that
Stranglehold.
Yeah, I know how this goes. I played against you one too many times and had that happen.
Well, it's very effective, especially when half the combos in the command zone, the other half, which also tutors the combo lock. So yeah, it's good times.
And then you've played at a couple of, we played last year, I believe, at Minneapolis at the Magic Fest. And I think you came and just played basically all day long and just ground games with us as well for that event.
Yeah, that's only like an hour away in the other direction. So, yeah, I always hit up those. Those are good times. I see everybody I know, and that's basically most of my social, group is in Minneapolis. So
sure. Well, that was funny in Minneapolis because you showed up with a brand new player. You're like, well, she knows how to play Magic, kind of. She never played Commander before, but what does she have a deck? So we had some friend of yours that we played games with who had never played before and ground a bunch of games with us that day.
Yeah, so more of an acquaintance. I literally met that person in the car on the way over.
Okay, so you're doing the work introducing new players.
Oh, yeah. I also introduced new players even in my hometown here. I started a Magic club for
nice.
Kids. Yeah, and mostly just, played a lot of Commander, precons and stuff I just bring to the store, and then everybody just grabs a deck and has fun.
Very cool. All right. Well, before we get on to the main topic, we have a few things we usually delve into here. And I think, Max, did you get a few games in last week? You actually got to play some?
I did. I played a couple on a Wednesday night before the Thanksgiving holiday.
How did that go?
They were a lot of fun. I got to play with new Commander Legends cards, so I got to test out Dramoka and Regna and Krav, and I'm impressed with some of these Commander Legend cards. I'll just put it at that for now. Had a lot of fun with them. Got to see everybody do their new things with new cards, so great games, no matter what the outcome was for me personally.
Very cool. I got to play a few on stream as well. Actually, you and I had talked about playing on Saturday and never got around to it. And then I don't think either of us jumped into the Channel Fireball stuff on Saturday.
Correct.
Did you play anything for that, Morris? Did you get online?
Unfortunately, no. I work the weekends, so
that's right.
Kind of off limits for me.
Well, Thanksgiving weekend too. It was like it wound up just wasn't an ideal time to get on. So I put a few on stream on Wednesday that went pretty well. But Commander Legends stuff has definitely been really impactful so far as I can tell. Not in a bad way. I think the cards all feel relatively balanced too. It's kind of seamlessly, at least what I've seen so far, has fairly seamlessly fit into the overall meta, and I'm really happy with the product. Well, if you out there in listener land like to reach out to us and talk about any fun games you played or your experiences so far with the cards from Commander Legends, how do you do that, Chris?
You can find us on a multitude of social media platforms. You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com, and you can also find us on YouTube by searching CMDR Central.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central and check out our reward tiers, such as the one Morris has been a part of, to get a guest spot on the show. Others include the Decks You Play series and just getting into our Slack to chat with us and all our other patron supporters and play some virtual EDH with all of us. This week we want to say hello and thank you to the following new patrons: Dylan Wood, Mike Maccabee, and Kevin Phillips. All easy names this week. Thank you. I'm just going to call that my holiday gift from our listeners.
You know, the next person who decides to be gracious and support us on Patreon, because we love all of you, you should make a name for your Patreon name that's just horribly hard for Max and just have him butcher it.
That's the week I'm taking off, Chris. You'll get to read that one.
Well, considering how many times we've absolutely slammed someone's name terribly, we should just put something in the Patreon sign up saying, could you please write down the pronunciation of your name in addition
phonetically spell your name for us, please.
I think a lot of people get a kick out of it. They're just like, oh, can he do it? Is he going to do it right?
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny, like almost every Commander podcast I listen to that has a patron, they're always like, okay, well, we're going to get this wrong. So it's definitely not just us. I've heard it on multiple other shows. I think a couple of those tiers also have playmats as a reward, which we have a nice box of here that we're going to be sending out to people here in the fairly near future. And they turned out really, really slick.
They are beautiful. I have mine.
I have one, and actually I put one in a frame that I was going to put on the wall behind me so it can kind of show up on the EDH Recast on video.
Nice.
But I didn't put it on the wall yet because I was, going to do that. And then my son informed me he would like to move his bedroom down to the basement where I record. So I might be about to relocate my entire recording setup to his bedroom and allowing him to move down to the basement. So I'm like, well, I'll just wait and decide if we're going to do that before I put anything else up on the wall behind me. But that will be happening whether I stay here or move to his bedroom for recording purposes. I'll put that up as well.
Why does he want the basement? That makes no sense to me.
I had like a basement room when I was roughly his age too. I don't know. I thought it was super cool being able to like move away from the rest of the family. So I'm guessing that's his logic. Room. Like he can put he can have like the first thing he said was, then I can have a couch down here for playing video games on. So like that's like his basically it's like his vision of having his own apartment down here essentially.
He just wants to sneak out at night. That's all he wants. That easy in and out.
I told I because there's kind of a side door off the side of the house, and we did have that conversation. Except for like that's just not his style,
right?
So, but it is there available to him, I suppose. So I think he's a little young to worry about that just yet. But yeah, at some point that will probably be a thing I need to keep an eye on.
You got what, at least 3-4 more years before you got to worry about that?
I would think so, but who knows? He's closing in on 14, so it is flying.
Really, 14? Yeah. I was thinking he was like 12 still.
No, he turned 13 last spring. So yeah, 14 is not far off.
Okay, so a couple years yet, but we're getting there.
Everyone in my office when I wandered in yesterday, because I had to go in for the first time in quite a while, were like, "Oh wow, your beard's really gotten gray." I'm like, well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for pointing that out to me.
Did you do any jabs back? Like, oh, you look like you've gained some weight.
I should have. I did not. I myself stayed polite, but yeah, more than one person commented on how gray I've gotten. So it is what it is. So let's just jump over here to the main topic now. We're going to talk about the steps we take when we brew up a deck. And we've talked about this before, but it was quite a while ago, and I think it would be interesting to discuss this too with somebody who isn't a content creator, who isn't like constantly looking at this kind of stuff. So I thought having Morris aboard for this conversation would be pretty useful for listeners as well. And we're going to talk about kind of the abstract of doing this, meaning what your thought process is and the mental steps you take when you decide you want to make a deck and try to figure out what you're going to do with it. And then we'll talk about kind of the practical things as well, how you figure out what cards you want to add, what things you want to cut, the pieces you assemble, that sort of thing. So to start, I think the first obvious question here is, how do you find your inspiration to build a deck? Is it a commander that kind of catches your eye when it's first spoiled, or when you see somebody else play it? Or is it the concept kind of that makes you want to build something else, and then you try to find a commander that fits that concept? So we'll start with Max here. Is there one of those two things that kind of tends to be the way you start building a deck, Max, or does it just depend?
I think it's a little bit of both, up until probably Commander Legends, where we got, 100 new legendary creatures. All we really had was Commander Precons and your standard sets every year. And
even those standard sets too tended, at least until the last 2 years or so, would have like a couple legends in them. And of those couple legends, not all of them really were necessarily commander viable. You'd get weird stuff that like just clearly couldn't be played in commander. Whereas the last 2 years, you're getting, a dozen or more legends in a whole lot of sets, almost all made with commander in mind. So that's really changed things too.
It has. What I was going to say is that I've never been a big fan of brewing a commander right out of the box, because that was pre-COVID. We were always at the LGS every week, and you just hear, if you have 30 people at your commander night and half of them want to build this card, the other half want to build this card, well, there were 2 decks I probably am not going to build anytime soon, because you're just going to show up in a pod of those 4 players playing the same commander. So I tend to look at colors first. Like, I always have my eye open for like a Dimir commander or a Rakdos commander, because those are 2 combos I never play or struggle to play.
Okay.
And if those don't really hit, then it goes to theme. So like Tuvasa would be a great example. I've always wanted an Enchantress deck, but I didn't build her right out of the box because everybody was hyped on the Kestia deck. I waited a year, found a YouTube video for a budget build of it, built that version, then tuned it to myself. So, I think I lean colors 75% of the time, theme or idea 25% of the time.
Okay. How about you, Chris? Is there a particular way you tend to start, or does it not really matter?
Well, so I pretty much just stick to the colors I enjoy playing. That's usually what I do. I go to a wonderful website called manabasecrafter.com, and I click on the color red because it's the best color in Magic, and I go from there.
Sure. And you just periodically go and look and just see if anything like jumps out at you?
Yeah. I'll look at them and see, if inspiration strikes or anything. But a lot of times, like, the best inspiration I get is by watching other people playing. And I see how cards, play together and what commanders they're playing. And then I think of the way that I would build that commander, and it's completely different than they would do it. And then I would, take it up from there. And half the time my ideas are wonderful, and then I just never get around to doing them anyways.
Yeah. I mean, having a glut of too many things is absolutely a problem. Trying to focus yourself down and just pick one can for sure be a thing.
It's very hard, especially when you have so many awesome red cards, because it's the best color in Magic.
Well, the last couple of years, though, we've definitely got some real good red. I mean, red feels much stronger to me now than it did a couple of years back, even.
Oh, it definitely does. It's on par of blue now, but still green's like off in the distance, running away, going, ha, see ya.
There we go. That's what I thought you were saying green every time, but now I heard it for sure.
Best color in Magic, we assumed you're just pronouncing green incorrectly.
Yeah, we just ignore green because, I don't know what happened to R&D and everyone else, but someone paid them off. That's what happened.
Okay, so Morris, you're kind of the guest here, and this is yours is the opinion I haven't heard before. So I'm curious, how do you go about doing this?
So there's a lot of times where when I go to different places, depending on the situation, if I'm going for a tournament, then that's a lot different than building for casually. So if I'm going for a tournament, there's, I think, 2 basic ways to go about it. One is if you have an idea what your meta is going to be, then you go for either what the top deck is going to be, or you can go for what's going to beat the top decks. Otherwise, you could also just try to, figure out what is a good strategy, synergy, and just, dive into that. But then there's not that many tournaments to do, so usually you end up building casually, and I think, the vast majority of players also do that.
Sure.
So then it's just, for me, it becomes, what pops out at me. Like, I'd say I go with the more mainstream commanders. Like, I have a Muldrotha, Animar, Kenrith, Najeela, that kind of stuff. I like my multiple colors. When I started, I was huge into, like, mono green, mono blue, whatever, because it was just a simpler mana base to make. It's very straightforward. It's kind of like, you just take it to the extreme. Like, you like green big creatures, all in. Here's all the biggest fatties that you can find, and the fastest way to get to them. Or, one of my first mono blue decks was Talran, which I know you have, and I enjoy the sheer value you get. Every spell that you play gives you a 2/2 flyer.
Right.
It's like a 2-for-1 in every single card, no matter what. So
someone described it as a very fiddly deck, meaning you're constantly fiddling around and doing things, but it's never wasting time. You are always making a step forward. You're always making a Drake. So even like when you're messing around with little cantrips, you're making forward progress towards a goal, and it feels like you are, like, it's a very tactile deck. You feel the progress being made, which is a really good bit of feedback, I think, as a pilot of that deck in particular.
The funnest part for me with Talran was, I remember specifically I had one game where it was just, Soul Ring, Talran, and then it was like Boomerang your land, and then like, was it Capsize your land, and then it was just spiraled out of control, and it was just Talran beatdown, like, right off the bat. And I've never had it like that before, because, Talran is more spells, and you don't think about having an army that fast.
Sure.
So it was a nice change of pace for, a deck that doesn't normally do that.
It can be played very much as a control deck that also is aggressive. It's not a control deck waiting for like that one win condition on turn 12. It can be a control deck that's like building a huge army of beats as it's playing control, which is a strange thing, but it is a lot of fun.
So those the casual part, the ideas are usually, like I have a Kenrith that's casual, and it's just, how can I make everybody not hate me? So,
sure.
Because
sure.
Because Kenrith has the opposite effect usually of that. So
you bet.
It's more of a group hug that if you let me hug too long, then I have the resources I need to win. And that's all it is. It's just building resources and, using them to my advantage when the time comes.
So it sounds like a lot of times too, you'd see something like a Muldrotha deck or the Animar deck, and they just look fun. Like when you watch someone play that deck or even just see the card, it looks like it would be a fun thing to pilot for you, and that kind of is what catches your interest to a degree.
Animar is one of my favorite decks.
Okay.
I just enjoy the creatures so much, the aspect of everything you're doing is creatures. And in fact, that deck I don't even run a Soul Ring, because I'm just all in on the 1-drop creature, ramp, and even 2-drop creature ramp, because with Animar, it just goes up the chain so nicely, that basically everything's a 1-drop in that deck. So, and it's just a different style of deck. Like, it's fun to play with all your different spells, artifacts, enchantments, and everything, but it's nice to have everything in your deck be a threat, It's
right, you bet.
You don't have to combo, you can just attack.
I think for myself, the best way to explain it, I think I'm looking for, to a degree, a little bit something different when I build a deck. The important thing for me is the creation of the deck. Like, I want the deck I play to be a singular, unique thing to me for the most part. My Talran deck is not that different than most Talran decks, I would say. It's very much like a token deck, but like it doesn't deviate that far from what you would see from a typical Talran list, but it's also an older deck. I think the ones, particularly the last few years when I've been building, it's been very much for me about the act of making a thing that's unique to me as much as it can be. So that's the starting point for me, and where I begin is what can I invent or create? That form of expression is where I start. So as a result, it's almost never for me about a commander catching my eye. It's about me starting with a concept and then trying to figure out how I can make that concept work. So to use some examples, because I've had a pretty productive year this year. 2019, I really only built a couple decks, but like I wasn't thrilled about them anyway. And the only one that really stuck was my Kresh deck, which I built early in the year. So like basically, February through the end of 2019, I just didn't. I think I actually tried 2 new decks, and neither of them lasted more than like a week. It just didn't work out. This year, I've got, I think, 4 decks out in paper, and I've got a 5th I'm kind of working on, or actually a 6th even. And I'm quite happy with at least 3 of the 4 I've built. And those were all ones where I started with a concept. So like, to a degree, a little bit of what Max does, where like I'm looking for color combinations that I don't currently have as well. But so like this year, one of the things I was trying to do was build decks that won without doing combat damage necessarily, but also not combo decks, because I'm not personally a combo player. So like, okay, well, if I can, build an infect deck, for example, was one of the things I thought I could do, but not do it in the combat step. How could I do that? So I spent, and I had that idea for quite a while, and I was trying to figure out how to make that work. The final one I settled on was a Timreth or Murder King deck, because he can deal damage by sacrificing creatures. So the plan is to give Timreth Infect, sacrifice stuff, and directly deal Infect damage to people. I'm not entirely sure the deck works. I'm still kind of tinkering with it, and I might change it to something else, but that's how that deck began. It was me starting with a concept and then trying to find a commander that fit it. I spent a long time trying to figure out how to make a Izzet deck, and that one definitely was a combat-based deck, because Izzet tends to not be combat-based. So in that case, I wanted to kind of flip it on its head and do an Izzet combat deck. I wound up building Adelays, and currently right now I'm testing the same exact deck almost with Crom and Kedis as partners instead of Adelays, but Adelays work just fine too. That deck's a ton of fun, but again, I started with a concept. I wanted an Izzet combat deck. How could I find an interesting way to build that? I built an Athrios Pestilence deck this year that was entirely based around how can I make a Pestilence deck. So I had the concept in my head, and I just spent like months, kind of brainstorming ideas before I would fall asleep at night, or like, just looking over lists of commanders, trying to figure out which one would eventually work. And I built a Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose, kind of a big black mana deck that's intended to use big, 14 mana into a drain life kind of spell situation. And that was also a way to use big black mana, but not use it in the combat step, to find ways to use it almost like you would in a fireball deck or something with Mizzix. So yeah, for me, very much, particularly in the last year or so, it's been about taking a concept and then finding a commander that makes it work. Particularly, usually not a new commander, but I mean, I'm obviously using Kedis, and Vito isn't that old either, so I've managed to get past my hang-ups about using new commanders that other people might also have.
And you're playing partners. Like, can we focus on that?
And I'm playing partners on top of that, right?
Who are you, and what have you done with Dana Roach?
And last week was the first week I actually tried that deck, having swapped out Adelays for Crom and Kedis, and I got to make a play on, like, I think turn 8, where I had, between a few mana rocks, I think I had like 10 or 12 mana available, and no one was really ready for it, because I already had Crom out, and I swung at somebody, and then then I dropped Kedis, swung at somebody with Crom, and then was able to, play Bloodlust to give him +4, -4, or -3 essentially, taking him up to 8, and then double the damage, and then give him double strike, which killed the person he hit, and then dealt 32 damage, whatever the heck it wound up being, to everybody else. So it absolutely worked. It was exactly what I wanted to do with an Izzet deck. So that was just me trying to find the commanders that best enabled the silly thing I wanted to do. So once you have that idea, whether it's, in my case, taking a concept, or like in Morris's case, seeing a commander that you think is fun, or in Chris's case, finding something that just works in the colors that you like, or in Max's case, an idea you've always wanted, and you finally found your commander for it. So how do you go about physically then building that deck? What do you add first? Or does it matter? Do you just kind of start throwing cards together? Is there a plan or a logic to it? Or do you just start brewing here? And Morris, I'll start with you to see what kind of your sequence is.
All right. Usually I kind of have like a list of must-haves, things you're never disappointed to get, high synergy cards that usually work with said commander. Those, usually are like, your doubling season, or, something that's, just you're never going to be upset to get.
Sure. If you're playing white, you're just going to put in a Swords to Plowshares. It's a 30-cent card. It's a great removal spell. You're just probably going to run it.
Yeah. Usually I have like different, categories as well, like draw, removal, win cons, utilities. All those different categories are great to have. And, especially for removal, when you get to the removal part, I just, like you said, Wrath of God or Austere Command or Swords to Plowshare, whatever your favorite is. Some decks, depending on the commander, I think the commander is one of the keys to building your deck, because sometimes you pick a commander just because it has built-in removal, or it has built-in draw, or it has built-in that way you don't have to worry so much when you get to that category when you're building your deck. Then usually when you get putting them all out there, you want to have a variety of choices. So you just start piling up all your cards that you want to add to your deck, and put them into different categories, and then you can always have a miscellaneous category, things that you just want to play, things that look fun. And and especially going back to the tournament styles, usually you're just trying to get it to however you're going to win. It's all about the win con. And
sure.
And then so that's just, you're just piling up tutors and draw and, card selection just to get to most of the time it's a combo win, so it's,
right.
It all depends on what your purpose is, but if you're going casual, it's like my Kenrith deck, it's just like, oh, what cards can I only put in this deck that I would never put into another deck, because this has such a high theme of trying to be friendly, mana for everybody, mana flare style things, draw for everybody, Howling Mine effects, just giving everybody everything, and then trying to get at least 2 other people on your side, so that way the person that does take too much advantage of it, you can all just go after them instead of the person that's giving it to them. So
particularly in that sense, you're assembling that line of play. So it's, finding your combo. So how can I get from point A to point Z? What do I need in the middle, and what do I need to enable that as many times as possible, kind of?
Yeah, and it's nice when, especially when you're building things to overlap. It's one of my biggest things that I'm thinking about is that when you're looking at tutors, you can't run all the tutors. You need to have
sure.
cards that actually do things. So I've sat down in front of a pile of tutors and say, well, I have to cut this one, because they only have 2 targets. You like to have, unless they're ridiculously important targets, you don't want to have a specific tutor for that. And even if you do, you probably want to have a backup target in case you drew it, So it's, cutting down, even in tournament style, you don't want to have 20 tutors, unless
right.
every single tutor is game winning, or it's
sure.
has a very specific reason that you absolutely want in that deck.
Yeah, so trying to find that balance between the win conditions you're going to get, the tutors that you're going to use to get those win conditions, or the ways to protect yourself, whether it's counter spells or whatever, while you're doing all of that. And you want some amount of each of those things, but finding that balance that works best is oftentimes something that's really difficult to do in the deck building stage. You a lot of times really need to just rep out that deck and get either games in, or at the very least goldfish out hands to get a feel for it, because at least for me that's really tough to eyeball, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, I've goldfished hands, but usually that's only in decks that are going to be for tournaments. I don't
sure.
usually go to that extreme when it's just a casual deck. It's just kind of see where it lies, just have fun with it, maybe it'll surprise yourself.
Sure. How about you, Chris? What's your actually when you've got the idea or the commander or whatever you're going to do, and you sit down and actually okay, I'm going to put some cards in this deck. What's your sequence, or how do you go about doing that?
So I take out a piece of paper and I do the math on it. Hush
every time I laugh at that paper.
You should see my notebooks that sit on my desk. Nice. where I do my cards and everything. So basically, you do the math. It's so depending on color wise, 35 to 38 lands, which leaves you with, the 62 to 65 cards left in your deck.
Right.
Minus the 1 for the commander leaves you with the 61 to 64 cards. So then you sit there and you're like, okay, I got these X amount of cards. And then I just take all these cards and I jam them into a huge pile. And I'm like, yeah, this looks good. Oh boy, now I have 500 cards. What do we do here? So that's basically how I do it. I don't use any online resources until after I have the deck, finally built. And then I go from there.
I didn't even know there was 500 red cards.
Right. Well, in with Max laughing about Chris using paper, but I've seen people, particularly on Twitter, that post here's my deck diary where I keep my deck ideas that I've written down, and so you're definitely not the only person that still likes to go old school with that, Chris. People absolutely do that.
It's so much easier to just have a pen and a pad of paper next to you as you're sitting with your cards and you're going through and you're sliding stuff in, and you're just you write a notch off and they're and you jot something down, like this card could go good, keep it in mind for next time and stuff like that.
Well, I do think there's definitely an aspect of all of this. Yeah, part of it's strategic, but like some of it definitely is what you find to be mentally enjoyable or pleasing, in whatever way. Kind of like how some writers still like to use typewriters, or, there's just the act of doing things in the way that you enjoy doing them is absolutely a thing that matters to a lot of people. So I will not criticize you doing it your way at all.
And I'm not criticizing.
That could even be a throwback to, Chris is a little on the older side, as is I am and Dana.
Sure. Yeah.
And, back in the day when you used to build decks, you didn't have a cell phone that you could just pop out and, you have those buttons that you have to hit multiple times. I'm sure half the people listening to this don't know what that means.
Well, I remember I think it was probably college, but like putting together a 60 card tournament deck, and there were no online resources for doing that. Like I remember sitting like watching TV and having like the coffee table in front of me and having 90 cards face up and me like, okay, if I put this in here, if I take this one out, like that was just how you had to do it back in the day. There was really no other way to build a deck. So yeah
I remember cleaning up my table full of cards and then also having a bunch of paper written on too. So it's not like that's just something you just automatically stop doing.
You bet.
Sometimes you don't have access to your phone, or you might get in trouble, if you're at work and
right.
you're just not supposed to be on your phone. But hey, you're jotting down some notes, huh? That looks like a diligent worker.
So how about you, Max? What's your technique here?
So I start with lands, and I'm kind of weird. I'll start with 36 basics. Like I always start at 36 for my land count in my decks, and then fluctuate where I want to be. I'll just start with 36 basics, and then I do something weird where, like, depending on if I'm in a 2-color deck, I'll grab all the non-enters the battlefield tapped dual lands, so your Shocks, your Battle for Zendikar lands, there's a handful of them, like a Horizon Canopy type land, anything that'll come in untapped and produce 2 colors. I add as well, and then, hopefully evenly split, take out 3 of one basic and 3 of the other, or however many they are. And then I just kind of go with, if I'm building because of a theme, so like an Enchantress deck, I just find all the cool enchantments I want to run in those colors with the strategy I want to do. So if I'm doing Voltron, obviously I want auras versus, just static enchantments that help my field or protect me or something like that. And then I just start from there, go to the theme, and then move on to like removal and draw are usually my last 2, because for the most part, whatever colors I'm in, I kind of have my go-to package of cards to run, so I don't really have to worry about them. I'm kind of I rely on the old faithfuls that have worked for me in the past, and I don't really like going outside of my comfort zone for those 2 categories, because what if I get burnt and this new card, after casting it 50 times over the span of a couple hundred games, it just doesn't do well for me?
That makes sense.
And I use Architect. I put everything there.
And that's really like the last year or so you've been using that, I believe, right?
Yep, I've bounced around. I started on Tapped Out, like most people, I think, did. Moved over to Deck Stats for a couple years, and now I've jumped on the Architect train.
I am using Architect too, and that's primarily the tool I use. Although, like you said, I once upon a time I started with Tapped Out, and that's where I start. I think part of that was a lot of times I would mess around at work, when I'm on a phone call or something where it doesn't need my involvement. I would tinker with decks, so like having it digitally available for whether I'm sitting at my desk at work or I'm at lunch at work or I'm on my phone or whatever, that was very useful to me. So that's part of the reason I tended to do things that way. Like you, Max, I start with lands first, because it just eliminates a thing. Like then I like you said, I know I'm going to be running 36, 37 lands, so I usually start with 37, and I'll immediately throw in like 7 of each basic, and then I'll go through and put in, because at this point I've been playing so long, I just have copies of basically everything except for the ABUR duels. So I know if I'm playing a Rakdos deck, I can throw in the Blood Crypt, because I just know I have one. I don't always remember what that list of lands are at this point, because there's just so many over the last several years. So Chris mentioned Mana Base Crafter. I'll usually go there and then just go down the list like, okay, here's the shock for the Rakdos colors. It's Blood Crypt. Here's here's what the check land is. So I'll just throw my lands in that I know I definitely have back home in my land binder. Throw my basics, throw in a few utility lands. Later on, I can tweak that. So, like, for example, if I'm playing some kind of deck that cares about sacrificing stuff more than normal, maybe I'll go through and, like, tweak it and put in, like, the High Market and the Phyrexian Tower and whatever. But I'll do that later on, and I'll pull out a basic when I do that, or pull out one of the slightly less effective dual lands or something. But I like to get those land slots taken up first, because then I feel like I've accomplished something too. Like, okay, I've checked off one thing. Like the deck is 1/3 of the way done, kind of, and you can do that in 5 minutes. So that always kind of mentally feels nice too, to have kind of checked that box. Morris mentioned going through and putting in some basic categories of things, and I then tend to do that as well. And like I mentioned, Source to Plowshare, there's a handful of those cards out there, and some people don't like the word staples, but the reality is Arcane Signet and Sol Ring are really good in the vast majority of decks. You don't need them in every deck, and you don't need them for sure. But there are some situations where, like, if you are just insisting on not running Sol Ring, it's because you're being stubborn. It's just probably good in your deck. Arcane Signet is just probably good in your deck. The Talismans and the Signets are probably good in your deck. And I'm not saying you need to run those, but most of the time, if you're not running them, it's just because you're kind of being stubborn. Myself, yes, I like to have a deck be interesting and creative, but I also don't feel the need to run uphill both ways. I'm just going to put in the good rocks because I have them. So I will then go through and kind of do that rough staple thing. Okay, I'm definitely going to be running these sequence of mana rocks. I'm definitely, I'm playing white. So I'm going to have a Swords to Plowshares and a Path to Exile because I know I have them. And it would be silly to run something worse because anything else is going to be worse, and they're easy to get and relatively inexpensive. So I know I'm going to run them. I'm not kidding myself. And unless there's some specific reason not to, I'll go through and throw in that basic sequence of, quote unquote staples that almost any deck is going to want regardless of what the theme is. So the swords will go in, the path will go in, the, a couple blue draw spells, a couple black draw spells, whatever the color sequence cares about, I will put those cards in there that you're always going to want no matter what, and that are always kind of going to be the best in slot, so to speak. After that, then I'll put in whatever theme cards I'm building towards. So, hey, I'm building a Pestilence deck. So let me put in my, Pestilence and my Withering Wisps and my, Pestilence Rats and my Pestilence Demon. And there's the handful of cards that enable what I'm doing. And obviously the deck wants then things that keep those cards from killing your creatures or keep those cards from hurting you. So I'll add in all of that stuff. And then I'm at about 140 cards usually at that point.
Yup.
So then I guess we jump over to the next question I have for y'all. Do you usually find yourself, once you've done that first pass, over or under? Because I've heard people talk about, I'm at this deck and I'm only at 90 cards. Does anyone have any suggestions for me to add? And that totally baffles me. I don't understand how people can do a first pass in a deck and only be at 90 cards, because I'm routinely at 130. So how about you, Max? Do you usually find yourself over or under? And how do you begin paring them down?
So I guess I didn't mention this in the last question, but I think out of all four of us, I'm the one who dislikes brewing the most. This is the one aspect of EDH I don't like. I hate brewing a deck. It's one of my least favorite things to do. I understand the process.
You just want to play.
Yeah, I just want to play. So I have, the last few lists I've built, I've taken inspiration from other content creators. So I've taken their list, looked it over, and then modified it for our meta at the shop, our VEDH meta through our Slack. If that's the case, then no, I'm never really short a card or over, because I already have the base 100 I'm working with. When I do build a deck from scratch on my own, though, I don't understand how people can be under either. I'm always at 140, and then that cut from 140 to 110 is really simple after I take that. Hey, I'm at 140, I can't figure out what to cut. You walk away for an hour, or maybe you sleep on it, you come back the next day, and those next 30 cards are super easy to cut. It's I don't need this 8-drop. Oh, this is the third version of this effect I have. I don't need that. When I get to that 110 point is where I'm struggling with cuts, and I ask for help in the community, because I don't think I'd ever finish a deck if I didn't get the help at that point.
That all sounds very familiar to me. How about you, Chris? Where do you find yourself, over or under, and how do you get to where you need to be from that point?
Oh, I'm always way, way over. Like, not even close to being where I'm supposed to be. So, it's actually probably the toughest part of deck building for Commander is the cuts that you have to make. So basically what I do is I look at each card type. So, you got your, what is it, like 8 card types or whatever it is. Yeah. And I see if you're like extremely saturated in one. So say you're running, there's like 30 sorceries that you put into this pile. And it's like, that's way too many. So you cut them down, so you have X amount of them, depending on, whatever your commander is. Because some commanders want you to cast spells, some don't. Next thing I do is I start cutting cards that are more of like what ifs. Like, I hate throwing Teferi's Protection in there, but that's like a what if card, a type of deal where like, well, what if they attack me? I need protection of some sort, Right. So I go in there because you don't want to be oversaturated on those neither. The last thing I do is then I start cutting high CMC cards that they don't follow curve, like my curve's sitting at like 4 CMC and I got these like 212 drop cards. It's like, nah, you guys can go. We don't need you.
You're not building green right if Galta costs 12.
That's usually where I go for that. And then, when I get down to like the last 10 or 12 cards that are left, I just randomly, I'll pull cards out that, I'm like, I don't know about this one. And I'll slap them in the box with the deck. And then when I'm playing, I'll look at the stack of cards that I have sitting there, the 10 to 15 of them. It's like, you know what? This card would be really good. This, everything has been playing. I should have this card in this deck, and then I'll look for a way to slop it into the deck.
So how about you, Morris? Where are you at with that? Are you usually over or under, and how do you usually clean that up?
So I'm usually very good at getting it to about 110. That's usually, where everything else is kind of just like an obvious, don't need this. But I agonize over those 10 cards, when I really want to get the list to, the sweet spot. So then, the first 8, they're okay. But then when you get down to the last 2, it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do here? And then just back and forth, but what if this, but what if that, you just hard to figure out what's going to work best in that deck. And at that point, it's just kind of like, I'll just take out, I'll look at the whole list and see, what card has the most pips that, probably needs to come out because it's not going to work with your mana base. Also, I need to say something about the mana base thing. When you guys put it in first, that boggles my mind because I think that it should go in last because then you can adjust your mana base to how many pips you have. So if you have a lot of, double pip things, then that's going to be very difficult to get, especially if you're in 3 colors, depending on, if you're going for basics or how expensive you want to make your mana base. And then I can't even think off the top of my head very many cards I run that are triple pipped because I always like to run the single pip cards as much as possible just because it makes your mana base so much easier. Just getting one of each, usually does the trick. But then again, I also run a lot of 5 color decks or, I don't even have any 2 or single color decks at the moment. I always just run 3 colors. It's...
Well, that's probably the main difference, definitely, because I would probably do that different if I was building, 3, 4, or 5 regularly. I'm almost always building 2 color or 1 color decks. So at that point, when you're tweaking based on pips, because I definitely do that. But at that point, it's a matter of swinging between, 8 of one basic and 8 of another to 11 and 5 or something. Usually takes care of that for me. Whereas absolutely, it's much trickier on a 3 color deck.
That's true. I never gave it that much consideration about the style of decks that you guys usually play compared to what I play.
But no, yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah, I definitely get that too, and I think that's why when I build something that I'm not comfortable with, like a 3-color deck from scratch, I tend to just stick with, hey, here's 12 of the 3 different basics I need, and then I do my tinkering at the last to kind of cover what you talked about, Morris, making sure I have a good balance between all the colors, and then that's when I start adding the duals and the utilities and whatnot. 2 colors I'm extremely comfortable with, so I think that's why I just start with the land base first.
I suppose that also gives you the opportunity to run all your different utility lands. I run very few in decks just because most of the time those utility lands are, colorless or,
right.
they come into play tapped, and usually, especially when you're playing triple color, you don't want them to come and play tap because then it's like, well, what if it's the 3rd land, or what if you have a good curve in your hand of 1, 2, 3, but you have a land that comes to play tap? That's going to mess up that, So Yeah, it's a good thing that you pointed that 2-color deck situation out for me, because that really does help with trying to wrap my brain around how you guys just say, hey, here's my lands, and then go from there.
I'm kind of with Max there. That first 20 cards when you're at 130 going on to 110 is relatively easy. You walk away, you come back a few hours later or whatever, and you make those cuts because you're like, yeah, I don't need that. That's clumsy. I do that thing the same way. The last 10 cuts for me tends to be a long process, like weeks, if not longer, where I've got it sitting there open on a tab on my laptop or open on a tab on my computer at work or wherever. And, I'll be doing something. I'll bring it up and stare at it for 10 minutes and no, nothing's jumping out at me, and I'll close it up. And I'll look at it 2 days later, and eventually something will pop up at me like, oh, I don't need this. Okay. So then I'll go down to 109 or 108, and then I'll think of something else 3 days later and add that in, something that I had missed the first time. And I'm back up to 109, and then I'll make 2 or 3 cuts and get down to 106 or 105, and I'm back up to 107 because I think of 2 other things that might work in the deck. So that literally tends to wind up taking me a month or 2 months or whatever, where that deck is sitting at 110 cards. Because I have 2 of them right now. I mentioned 1 or 2 decks that are kind of in progress. I have 2 of them that are sitting at around 108, 110, where I'm still trying to figure out how I want to, oh, I don't want this, do I want this? If I take these 3 cards out, then I can make this work this way, but if I leave them in, I can do so. I'm never in a rush for that, and those are kind of sitting there in the back of my brain, bouncing off one another, and I will just make those cuts when something jumps out at me. I'm in no hurry. So that last bit is a process. I also like going to use, in our Slack, for example, bouncing, hey, is anyone having suggestions for cuts here? Just hearing people talk about it is oftentimes useful. It's not even so much someone saying, you don't want that card. It's someone saying, oh, so why is that card in there? And then me having to justify it oftentimes makes me then realize maybe I don't need it. That's a good point. Or it makes me realize something else isn't going to work with the way I'm doing that. So that's also a very good utility. If you aren't in a Discord or a Slack or something, even the people on Reddit can be monsters, but they also can be helpful sometimes. Any kind of a community like that, even people on Twitter post deck lists and get feedback at times. So getting some community feedback can be very helpful for making those last few cuts as well, to try to kind of squeeze it down to your 100, because I agree that gets super tricky. Max and I both mentioned using Archidect. Moxfield is a very similar site. I'm using Archidect because it came out first, but Moxfield is a very similar one with the same. It has a gold fishing app. It's very visual. So you would, I think, anyone who wants to use a deck building site, I would recommend one of those 2. One thing I've been doing a little bit lately is I actually lay my cards out, and I've always done this to a degree. I lay them all out, and you can do it basically in Archidect to kind of look at the whole deck and get a feel for, okay, do I have enough draw? Do I have enough removal? Do I have enough whatever? The first time I kind of did it as a joke, when I put the cards all up on a bulletin board, like a murder board, and ran string between them all, okay, these are all the draw spells. It was done as a joke, I wasn't seriously building a deck that way. But it wound up being kind of useful to put that up there and look at it and just see how much stuff I have of each thing. So while I still do it as a joke, it also wound up being kind of an interesting exercise for me to eyeball the deck and see, okay, I think I actually need 1 or 2 more of these things. So I'm still doing it for fun, but also is a useful thing. And you can emulate that very easily, just visually laying stuff out in a deck builder. Are there any kind of last minute tricks like that you guys do to kind of eyeball it before you maybe pick up the cards you don't have and put that deck together? How about you, Morris?
Yeah, I actually lay out my cards all the time too on a table. I don't have a murder board, so I think it's very helpful too. It's nice to see the quantities that you have of different cards, if you're lacking in one or another. Yeah, and in those different categories that I mentioned before, that's kind of how I usually pile them out. Yeah, I think it's very helpful. It's nice to be able to move things around like that, so that way you can, it's like, oh, does this really belong over here? You can see all your cards clearly. You can see if you're missing anything, give them a count, put them in piles of, 10 or whatever helps you out. Lots of times I have all my cards are sleeved the exact same. So I have 10,000 blue sleeved cards. So that way I can move things back and forth without having to, binder. But it's nice to be able. It's like, oh, that's not going to work out. Let's swap it for this, and then just go, finish off the deck like that. That's usually what I do when I'm, figuring out the last steps of that.
How about goldfishing? You mentioned do that mostly just for like tournament level decks. You're not doing it for casual ones just to see how they play.
Definitely for tournament level decks, because in tournaments, your opening hand is like the key. So if you're doing I'll just go through my shuffle it up, draw 7. Look at, is that a keepable hand? Put it down. Next 7, all the way through the deck, and see and then after that, shuffle it up and do it again, and see how many times I have unkeepable hands. What's the reason that it's not keepable? Is this an acceptable amount of hands that you should be throwing back? How greedy do you want to, sometimes I'll take a mulligan and see, it's like, oh, this was close, or this hand was just ridiculously bad. Let's mulligan and see how it would have turned out, and just go through that. And enough times to where you're like, okay, well, what were the problems with that? Because that's one of the biggest when you're building a tournament deck with all your tutors and your draw and everything else. It probably won't be lasting that long of a game. You
right.
should have a good feeling about your hands. If you're gonna be keeping them. So and it's like, oh, did you have enough draw? Did you have enough ramp? Did you have a combo piece or a tutor, or and lots of decks like Animar, for example, you want to have a mana dork, or something, is this an acceptable hand? Can I get Animar out turn 2 or Najeela out turn 2? That's because in tournaments you definitely want them out as soon as possible.
Right. So that is real in that context. That's where you find that really useful.
Yes.
Okay. How about you, Max? Do you have a preference here when it comes to doing anything to kind of finally tighten anything up? Do you goldfish deck a lot?
So to answer the first thing about like laying stuff out, so like I mentioned earlier, I use Architect, and actually for the first time last week I used their custom categories. So you can create your own. So you have your draw, your creatures, and whatnot. I see why people use them. I get too specific with them because I was using it for Regna and Krav because I had like 10 changes in the deck from Commander Legends for that deck. And so like my custom categories were super specific from like creature removal and then removal on a creature and like draw on a creature. It got way too specific, and that's just my intricacies of my brain doing bad things right there. So I get why people like the custom categories. I'm perfectly fine with the standard creature, artifact, sorcery, instant, planeswalker, all that fun stuff. As for goldfishing, I use the built-in goldfisher on Architect with like what I think is my final 100, and I'll do 100 test games where I play the first 5 or 6 turns in with the deck, do a couple shuffles, redo it, do that about 100 times. But I feel like the virtual goldfishing isn't anywhere close to like actually having the cards in your hand. I think it makes it more real for me. So like when I goldfish with an actual deck in front of me, I get in the form of I'm actually sitting in a pod. How would I mulligan this hand? Would I keep this hand? If I keep this hand, what do I need to make sure I can do something in 3 turns, So yeah, I think goldfishing, even for the casual player like myself, is extremely important. And just for the fact that, if you take a break from EDH and you kind of need to remember how to play your deck again, looking at the list might do it for you. Awesome. You look at the list. Oh yeah, I remember how this deck plays, but goldfishing a few hands might just really get your memory, jivened up a little so you can really figure out, oh yeah, this is how this deck works. I should be looking for XYZ cards to put this combo together if it exists. Or these are the three best creatures in my deck, and this is how I get to them. Stuff like that.
What Max was talking about, where you get goldfishing hands on like your deck building site, I don't like that idea, just because those have like an algorithm to shuffle your deck, and that's not how real people shuffle. If you shuffle your deck in a certain way or whatever, then maybe you want to goldfish how you shuffle your deck, because some people definitely don't shuffle their deck good enough. So maybe that'll also help figure out problems with your deck too, if that's the problem, if you're just not shuffling good enough. So I think it gets closer to the real world application rather than an algorithm doing it perfectly for you.
The one thing I myself really like about kind of gold fishing isn't so much getting a feel for how the deck plays, although it is sometimes useful for me to like feel like, oh, you know what, I don't have enough colored mana in here. I need to pull 1 or 2 utility lands out or things like that. But the real thing that jumps out at me then is looking at the hand you've dealt yourself out and saying, okay, that card isn't very good here in this situation. I don't want it. I'm opening it in my hand for this reason. So then you like deal out 2 more hands and get the card again. And you're like, I don't want it now either. And I've caught myself, or I've caught cards in my deck that way where I realize having it in my hand makes me not want to have it. Even though you can't see that for whatever reason when you have the whole deck put together, once you've like goldfish out a hand and you've, played 1 mana rock or whatever, you just realize this card just doesn't work in this deck for whatever reason. One thing that jumped out at me was with when I built that Athrios Pestilence deck, I had a handful of board wipes in there, and one of which was Toxic Deluge and one of which was Merciless Eviction. And it wasn't until I goldfish out a hand and realized, oh, my commander's indestructible, and I don't want to cast this board wipe right now because I don't want to cast Merciless Eviction because it's going to also catch my commander. Whereas if I ran one that wasn't a exile effect, my commander would survive that, and that seems more useful to me than the exile and Merciless Eviction in that case. And I didn't mentally make that connection until I actually goldfish out a few hands and had the card in hand and looked at the board state and went, I don't want to cast this right now. So that's the one thing with goldfishing that has always been useful, at least for me, is seeing those kind of things that you don't really realize until you're kind of simulating playing a game. How about you, Chris? Is there anything you particularly do after you've kind of got the deck assembled to see if you're happy with it? You said you don't usually put things online. Do you just test draw hands yourself, or what do you do? Is there anything?
Yeah, I goldfish the deck. I'll do it probably about 20 times or so, taking 10 turns each time or whatever. And mainly the biggest reason for that is just to see how the curve plays, how the mana base sits. It also gives you like a sufficient randomization of the deck. So when you actually sit down across from an opponent, it's already shuffled. It should be pretty good, and you just shuffle it up again and you don't have to worry about it. Whereas I've seen lots of times when I'm playing with people where they're like, oh, I'm mana screwed or I'm mana flooded or something. It's like, well, did you just build that deck? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, you did not shuffle it good enough. That's why I like pretty much goldfishing it most of the time, is just to get a nice sufficient randomization of the deck.
Yeah, that is very helpful as well. And you can also then kind of quote-unquote play it against another deck. You can bust another deck of yours and also do a test hand and just kind of see how they butt against one another if that's what you want to do, because I've done that before too. So we've kind of gone over front to back our personal theories and techniques for doing this. Are there any final thoughts on like tips you have or things you want to share here before we wrap things up? Max, do you have anything you want to throw out there?
I think there are plenty of resources online to help you build your decks, whether it's EDH Rec or Mana Base Crafter or streamers out there. There's a lot of people that do weekly deck building streams. Mana Curves, Chase over at Mana Curves does one every week. Those are fun to jump in and watch. And maybe seeing how other people brew their decks will help you brew your own deck if you struggle with brewing, kind of like I do sometimes.
No, that's a really good point. I've watched her. Benny Smith does one as well every couple weeks. Just seeing other people put a deck together. And then it's not just them too, like they're getting it and they're also taking feedback from listeners. So you have multiple people throwing ideas out there. And even if like you're not building a particular deck, it's just oftentimes, I think, useful to see what other people do and how their brains work. I think that's definitely a useful thing. So that's a good call, Max. How about you, Chris? Any final thoughts here?
Your deck is never going to be perfect, and don't ever think that it's, when you're done with it, that's what it should be. Just play the cards you have, enjoy it, and, modify it as you go. That's the best, advice I could give someone.
I would say in a lot of things in this world that advice applies. You should not let you should not let wanting something to be perfect get in the way of enjoying something that's good. Because it's never going to be perfect, and just be happy with it being good and go from there. And that's a really good bit of advice, Chris. I like that. Morris, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, I completely agree with Chris, and I think playing is huge for discovering weaknesses in your deck, because when you sit down with opponents, you don't know what they're going to do at all. Like, right. EDH is the craziest format there is, because such crazy interactions happen that you don't know what's going to be good. You don't know what's going to be an all-star in your deck until you actually sit down and play with other people and see if they view the same thing as a threat, or if it's just fine. Like, is it going to sneak past your opponents and then become an all-star in your deck, or is it going to draw you immediate hate, and you might just want to cut it because you just don't want that.
Kind of on that same vein, the thing I would say that you should look for, particularly when you're kind of doing that final polish or even playing that very first game, be aware of how your deck interacts with people around you. Like, is this not fun? Is this creating not fun interactions? At least based on the group you're with. Like that, if you're playing with a different group every time, that maybe doesn't matter. But there's definitely situations where I've found a deck I just built, and that's maybe the biggest problem with my Pestilence deck so far that I've been trying to tweak, is I can oftentimes wind up in kind of a soft lock situation where, because I have a Pestilence out and I have mana available, people can't play creatures because they're just going to immediately die. So if I can't win right away and I know we're going to have 10 minutes of me just grinding everybody down, being unable to play any creatures, that's not the most fun situation in the world. So I'm trying to figure out with that deck how to fix that, because I don't want to sit down at a table, particularly with strangers, and have them wind up, on turn 8, all of a sudden, like, oh, my creatures just died and anything I play is just going to die anyway, so I better hope I draw Disenchant. That's something to kind of pay attention to in that last final step too. Even if you're happy with how the deck plays out, be aware of how it affects the other people you're playing with. And are they happy with how it plays out?
In that case, you might even want to just keep it in your arsenal and just play with certain people.
Yeah, and maybe you can't fix it. And like in the case of that Pestilence deck, maybe I can't. One of the things I've been trying to do is put additional damage sources in there, so I'm not just relying on the Pestilence just to kind of speed things up. So like, I've added a wound reflection recently, like, okay, well, that just to make it easier to actually end the game with the Pestilence effect. I added a Karma recently. So like, I've been tweaking in that direction to help be able to close out the game faster so people aren't stuck in a lock. But yeah, also a situation where like maybe that's just how the deck is going to play and I can't necessarily avoid that either. And I need to just bear in mind the group I'm playing with when I break it out too, for sure. All right, Morris, thanks a lot for joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the show. You were one of our early patron supporters and one of the earliest ones at this tier as well. It's a big deal to have people actually like believe in the content that we've made and help us make it by supporting the show. So thank you very much for supporting us and for coming on and for being patient as we were able to get in a situation where we could have you back on or have you on in the first place. So thanks a lot. I just want to say it means a lot to all of us.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, Morris.
Yeah, it was you guys were the first time I logged onto Patreon because I was like, hey, these guys are awesome. I'm going to support them. And I really enjoyed, especially before COVID and stuff, I really enjoyed hearing about, local things happening. Sometimes
Sure.
I was a part of it. Sometimes I wasn't. But, it was really a kind of a different experience that, it's like, hey, I know what they're talking about. I was there. I saw that, or hey, that was my play, that was...
Yeah.
Those are fun things, especially when I was just getting into podcasts and stuff. It was just an experience that you don't get very often.
Well, hopefully here in the not too distant future, we can get back to playing some real life games with you as well.
So before we sign off for the day, I just want to remind all of our listeners that on December 20th, which is a Sunday night, Dana and I have been invited to the Scrap Trawlers stream for their December episode. We'll be playing some virtual EDH, and this month's episode is all about charity. So they are doing a raffle where if you donate $5 or more in $5 increments to No Kid Hungry, and you send your proof of donation to them, and we'll put all this info in the show notes. You'll earn raffle tickets to the prizes, some of which are our new playmats, some good commander singles like a Craterhoof Behemoth. There's some sealed product. So Andy and Nick are doing some great stuff over at the Scrap Trawlers channel on Twitch, and they're also on Twitter. And we're excited to play with them and be able to finally reveal the decks we'll be playing later in the month.
I actually just ordered the last cards I needed yesterday, Max.
Mine came
later this week.
My entire deck came yesterday.
Nice. yeah, looking forward to that. So that should be right before Christmas. Hopefully the deck will be together soon, and we'll announce those, like Max said, in the fairly near future. So that is going to wrap up this episode of Commander Central. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show was edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find him on the Twitter birds at Ursa Bearwalker, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Morris, even though I won't be here next time.